So good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to the panel discussion on raising digital forensics and unimaginable fraud possibilities. So we have an eminent speaker with us. So I welcome Dr. Sriram Birudalo, CEO, Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, DSA, who will be moderating the session. I welcome you, sir. I welcome Dr. Anup Shetty, IPS, Superintendent of Police, Cybercrime Division, CID Karnataka. I welcome you. I welcome Vishal Salvi, CEO, Sequrite. I welcome you, sir, for the panel discussion. And also I welcome Hilal Ahmad, CISO, Razorpay, uh, for the panel discussion. So over to the moderator. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the session. First of all, to all the panelists, eminent panelists here, and to you people, the audience who are here to listen to us. After lunch session is always a bit of a challenge, but we'll try and make this very interesting so that you have many takeaways. So they come from different backgrounds. Anup comes from the police and the law enforcement. Hilal comes from Razorpay, which is a fintech startup, a fintech company, and Vishal, of course, comes from the industry, corporate, in which he was in Infosys earlier as a CISO, and now he's with Quick Heal as the CEO. Okay, so you can't probably possibly get a better panel than this, but the thing is that going to the topic now, with the increasing attack surface, right? Rising digital footprints everywhere. How are the possibilities of fraud increasing? What are the areas that we need to be extremely careful about? And how is it expanding? What dimensions does it have? These are the things that we would like to explore in this panel discussion. Because many people have been at the receiving end in the sense that they have been negligent in these respects, saying they did not protect their infrastructure adequately, and one day they get a love letter saying that, look, you know what, the entire infra is locked, or stuff like that. So there are, of course, several areas here, ranging from email, you have IoT, you have uh, your threat intel, and also you also have, of course, the everything else, the external world. By external world, it could mean that supply chain attacks, or it could be external hackers, it could be insider threats also, things that you're really not catered to in a sense from pure domain perspective. So there are very many areas, and we would not, of course, time will not be sufficient to explore this in depth, but we'll look at some key areas that people need to be watchful of. So I'd first turn to Vishal and say that what are the top three concerns that you see in this respect, that people, what are the possibilities for fraud, the concerns that the rising digital footprint is giving rise to possibilities of unimaginable fraud in many respects.
Hey, good afternoon to everyone. I don't know, because this is a fraud session, most of you are sitting behind and none of the people are in the front. So don't worry, we are not going to do any frauds here. No, I think, being the CISO of HDFC Bank for almost a decade, I think, I've been able to sort of look at, how the fraud ecosystem has evolved in so many years, and then being in touch with the banking system and banking CISOs, even right now, I have still good understanding of what's happening. I think the first thing what we need to understand is that as there is a growth in the e-com and the digital payments, it obviously creates a very large attack surface, right? And primarily, the fraud follows the money, right? That's really the primary definition of how fraud has grown. And clearly the money is in the banking system and in the commerce, e-coms, right? So that's where you'll find the maximum amount of innovation that is happening. And we used to call this, the second aspect of how fraud has evolved is the fraud as a service, right? So we have talked about it in terms of how the whole ecosystem of fraud works. The global ecosystem works, in terms of the person who actually develops the software, the person who's able to buy the software, and I'm talking about malware right now, and then how the money mules are onboarded, how the credential harvesting happens, and then how the actual encashment happens and how the money is moved out of the country. So clearly there is a full life cycle of how this fraud evolves, and there are systems, right? The dark web has its own system, where you can go and log in and buy, credit card numbers by paying money, and or you can buy harvested credentials of net banking and so on and so forth. So fraud as a service has uh, been there and is constantly evolving with proper organization structure, proper SLAs in terms of how they manage it. So that's the second part, and I think the third part is, it is always keeping in pace with how the digital commerce is evolving, right? So when I was talking recently to the banking CISO, he was talking about how in-memory attacks have grown, how client-side validation attacks have grown, and surprisingly, even now in today's day and age, a lot of organizations still don't do server-side validations, right? And that gets compromised. So really, three broad reasons why frauds exist in the first place. One is obviously the fundamental commercial reason that fraud follows where the money is. Number two, the exponential rise of e-commerce and digital payments in the country specifically. We are number one right now in the world in terms of digital payments. And number three, the evolution of and constant innovation that we are seeing by the threat actors across the value chain, across the system, where there is a trust model, SLA-based innovation infrastructure that they do, which is why there is a constant increase, and therefore the CISOs are always kept on their toes in terms of managing this fraud. So these are the three things that I can talk about.
Thank you very much, Vishal. So we increasingly see that there are a number of possibilities. For example, take open source. Okay. In that, it is found that about the survey, 84% of the softwares had open source vulnerabilities, and as many as 91% had, unpatched systems. So, which means that they're not up to date. So, in order to do that, several solutions also have been given. For example, SBOMs and VAPTs and all those things which are there. So that is there. So we attack the thing at the root. One is the pure technical side, where you have vulnerabilities and all these things. And of course, there's a human element which we will try and solve through various different aspects like blockchain and many other things to prevent fraud from happening. So from the perspective of law enforcement agencies, what does the scene look like?
Thank you, Dr. Sriram. Before going to the law enforcement, I would say, as a common person, as a non-IT person, if I see my activities today, I mean, the world is getting smaller, and of course, COVID has, helped us increase the pace. So today I'm interacting with the person, a journal in New York, and a friend in Herzegovina, and making payment to a organization in UK. I mean, as an individual, not as an organization. And that itself says the extent of digital footprint I'm, creating. If I go one step further, my personal information is part of at least 3 data breaches, and it is existing, and I can't do anything about it. Now, that is a level of information that is available that says about the possibilities. Now, if we have to talk about concern areas, I would say number one is, which is upcoming, is decentralization of crime. As Sir has told, fraud as a service, but At a high tech, yeah, I mean, high tech crimes, you have the service providers not only related to hacking or other aspects, but there are other types of crimes, for example, forging of documents where services are available. In low-tech crimes, if we take the national scenario, today, earlier it used to be like one particular criminal or one particular gang which is operating at one place. Now we see a SIM card address from Manipur and it is being used in Delhi. An account created in Kerala or Madhya Pradesh, it is being used in Rajasthan, which is complicating the investigation for us, for a law enforcement. That becomes more complicated and it delays the process. That is a recent development what we see. Second point is transnational nature of the crime. If we see, it starts from our neighborhood. I remember last year we were investigating a online fraud, and my officer went for arrest, and then he called after 3 hours saying that the accused is your neighbor. And that is a level of closeness, and if we go far, it is as far as unheard countries like Gibraltar, which are reflected in our investigation, where it is very difficult for a ordinary investigator sitting in Bangalore or any other place to crack that case. So thirdly, multi-stakeholders involvement in IT infrastructure. Multi-stakeholder means, for example, there was a case of a pharmacy company where this data breach has happened. The maintenance and development and maintenance is done by one organization, and hosting is done in different organization. Its payment and delivery is handled by another organization. And finally, this hosted cloud service is from a different company. Now, it becomes complicated for the firm. The pharmacy company has no idea what is happening. And for us also, it becomes, because there starts the blame game. Now, that is also a increasing concern for us. So these 3 points, which I see from a law enforcement perspective, are making things complicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anup. Yeah, I'd like to have Hilal from Razorpay FinTech's point of view.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sriram. So I totally second Vishal and both provided some valuable insights into the current trends of frauds. So from fintech and tech side of frauds, right? So it's just mind-blowing, like how fraud has actually evolved over the years. Like as Vishal just mentioned, that fraud as a service. Nobody would have actually conceived that such a thing may actually happen in future, right? So, but it happens, right? So then there is multiple different aspects of fraud that we never envisioned that could actually happen. Like, so for example, I'm sure most of you have heard about basically the WhatsApp frauds, right? I saw the message and somebody forwarded that message to me and saying that, okay, multiple people got the same message. So I said, it's like an obvious fraud. You can see that from the message that they're asking you to send some money. So it's an obvious fraud. So why would you fall for that? Surprisingly, half an hour later, I get a call that somebody has actually transferred the money. So, which is so whatever our assumptions are that the people are smart enough to detect what is a genuine and what is a non-genuine transaction does not actually turn out to be that. So the way the people masquerade and the way people actually swoop their identities is actually incredibly complicated, right? On top of that, if, for example, we were just sort of dealing with such high-tech attacks or low-tech attacks, right? What has actually complicated the scenario is the entry of state actors, right? So, for example, you have now apps actually, fintech apps actually coming in they try to basically manipulate people into basically like investing money or basically buying something or did not. Some of those apps actually pass all the checks. They pass the KYC checks, they pass the basically the audit checks, they pass all sorts of basically like precautionary measures that we have put in place to make sure somebody does not commit fraud, but they pass those checks somehow. So, and what results in actually is basically massive fraud. You might have heard about the Chinese apps actually committing those frauds, right? And now nobody can trace them, right? And that happens because of multiple coordination with different people, different agencies, and all that. So the complexity of the attacks and the complexity of the fraud has actually evolved. It has become like so much complicated now that we are actually struggling to keep up with the pace of those attacks. So what that actually tells us is that like we no longer are basically like playing in a traditional, even basically battleground. It's like totally different now. So we have to be equally smart. We have to be equally basically like adept at identifying those and making sure that all those fraud possibilities actually do not actually basically come forward for that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hilal, for those insights. So if you were to split the attack surface itself, Microsoft identifies 6 areas, which are email, identity, endpoint, IoT, Internet of Things, cloud, and external. Okay. So, of course, one way is to neatly classify and then protect every area, where external could include everything like the massive third-party risks and all those, to supply chain risks and all of those things, okay? And a dark web and all those things where malwares are and all. So this is one way, the one of the things. Now, if you were to look at the things that constitute risk, and risk has to be estimated for every organization individually because their business to business it varies, it will comprise of 3 components. One component is the threat landscape itself. Comparing it to a health pandemic, probably you would see that if a disease is more prevalent in the city, then you're more likely to catch it. The second one is the vulnerability, which means out of 100 people in this room, probably some have a stronger constitution, some have a weaker constitution. Probably the ones with weaker constitution will catch it, which means you need to tighten our own cyber posture. And the third one is obviously impact. Is it a disease that's just like a flu or some small disease that will come and go away, or is it a life-threatening thing that will simply kill or cripple the organization? So these 3 together will constitute risk, and the risks due to rising digital footprint are simply increasing by the day because you take, when everything has gone digitalized, take a small example like insurance industry. In that, at the time when a person applies for insurance, he's submitting a lot of data, information. Then at the time he files for a claim, okay, so even if, supposing he has not been issued the insurance, it's been rejected, also still that organization has the data. Then at the time when he files for a claim, when he's admitted to hospital and he files for a claim, there is a lot of data that he submits. At the time at which he closes or he renews it, again, there's a lot of data which is there. So at every point, there are different parties involved probably, which could be the healthcare provider, which could be the insurance player, which could be different people. So as a result of it, there is possibility for leakage of data everywhere, which can all be in turn be used for a lot of fraudulent activities. So this is one of the most frightening aspect of it. And we have, beyond the mere possibility of frauds, there are the other things which are at play. For example, hospitals are currently being attacked, not only for the data of the patients and all these things, but some foreign player can develop bioweapons out of it. So that is one major threat right now, saying that can eliminate entire segments of population, bioweapons, they're testing out. So COVID was like a small Sunday school picnic compared to the threats that are lying ahead, is what people feel. So given this entire spectrum of possibilities and unimaginable frauds and threats, what could be the possible solutions to this? Or how do we intervene? And what are different ways in which you intervene? It could be technical, it could be regulatory, it could be social, it could be various different management and all. So yeah, Vishal, turn to you.
So I think, before I answer that, we need to understand when you look at fraud, there are 2 broad types of frauds, right? One which is happening on your corporate infrastructure, like your applications and servers, which is basically your data center or cloud. Another is what is happening on the user end, the consumer end. So there are events like, for example, the Rag Bank, Bank of Muscat fraud, or the Bangladesh bank fraud, or the Cosmos bank fraud. All of these are obviously examples where a specific targeted uh, attack was orchestrated on a specific targeted bank, and a, a given vulnerability was exploited, and hence the fraud happened, right? But I think if you look at most of these frauds, they are obviously, uh, infrequent, and they are unique. And once they happen, obviously the industry responds and fixes those vulnerabilities. So by and large, you cannot sort of have a pattern for these kind of frauds. They keep evolving, and they become like a once in a blue moon kind of event, and then become case studies. But one thing which is on an ongoing basis happening at scale is the one which is happening on the customer side, which is either happening on the customer identity or on the consumer device. And, and that is where the fraud as a service becomes more applicable, and that is something which is ongoing, right? Because it is evergreen, and the thing is, it's become very difficult for you to sort of protect the consumers, right? Because institutions always are able to ring fence what they can control, which is their infrastructure, their applications, their processes, and by and large, they do significant amount of investment to do that. But the consumer end remains vulnerable, and as we become more and more innovative by adding more and more devices, methods, transactions, the attack surface grows, and therefore that access happens. So I think we need to understand what's happening for us to then look at what are the possible solutions. So I think when you look at the consumer frauds, I think the first thing which I think one needs to happen is within the industry, there is an evolution of the cybersecurity as a profession, and therefore teams within the organization which are doing cybersecurity controls and risk management related to cyber. And the other part, especially those who are really worried about fraud, there is a separate team which is the risk team, which has evolved, right? And they are not the technical teams, but they understand really how the frauds are getting investigated, and they manage the whole life cycle of the fraud. Now, what has happened is that as we are getting more and more digitized, frauds are actually exploiting a digital infrastructure. And so the cyber team has to play a very prominent role in helping in not just, sort of helping in putting controls, but also to do forensic, to understand root cause analysis and play an active role in management of these fraud operations. So I think the first solution is about how do we sort of get both these teams to work together in collaboration to address this issue, right? If they work in silos, then actually it can be a big disaster, because frauds are now, most of the frauds which are happening in modern organizations are all digital. And therefore, cyber team needs to play a prominent role in managing that. So that's number one. The second part is that if you look at in terms of the evolution of the fraud, the technologies which are helping you to manage frauds, you need to come out with something which works on a real-time basis, which means you are looking at the transaction, the velocity and the various attributes of a transaction, and be able to sort of predict whether I need to stop that particular transaction in real time, or I allow it and then do a review afterwards. So as an example, for example, in good old days, whenever you do a credit card transaction, immediately after you walk out of the the shopkeeper, you will get a call from the bank saying that, hey, did you do this transaction? So that is basically validating afterwards, and authenticating a outlier kind of a transaction. Now, obviously, banks have automated that. So you get a IVR message and you have to say, yes, it was me who did the transaction. So, which is a good thing, but behind the scene, it's a technology which is working, right? The fraud management technology which is working. And for a long period of time, we were saying that we will do near real-time fraud detection, but not real-time fraud detection. So today, the modern organizations are looking at real-time fraud distribution. That the first transaction itself you'll be able to detect and stop. And that's the thing that we need to aspire to go, right? So that's the second part. And the third part is really about, it's not a lone battle that we are fighting, right? So we need to sort of collaborate and work together as a community and support each other and work together, because it is finally a systemic problem, right? So it needs to be solved where the banks, the insurers, the capital markets, and any other organization like fintech and all needs to come together and create a ecosystem, secure ecosystem of figuring out processes, methods, controls, which cannot be treated as a competitive advantage, right? Everybody needs to have a common minimum framework so that we are able to address it as an ecosystem, which means stronger collaboration, institution creating methods by which we can come together, create those frameworks. I remember, when I was the CISO of HDFC, we came together and created a forum for PCI DSS, where all the banks came together and talked about what we need to do to create the overall improvement in terms of PCI DSS for the merchant compliance, which was so important to address the frauds which are happening on the merchant side, right? And it cannot be a competitive example where one bank says, I will not onboard a merchant unless they're PCI DSS compliant, but some other banks onboard them. It loses the purpose. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to say. You need to create a common minimum framework as an ecosystem, because otherwise that one bank which is allowing, exception will actually drive the way the fraud emanates within the organization. So these three broad things will perhaps help in helping us to be, in forefront of tackling frauds.
Thanks a lot for those insights, really, Vishal. You touched upon a number of areas. So obviously, there are many things of concern, and one of the moves has been to reduce the human element here and go in for automation. So Gartner quadrant indeed focuses on hyper-automation in cybersecurity, if you look at the predictions of Gartner. So that is there. And there's a whole spectrum of things there. But one of the things is the human fraud-related ones are how do we prevent things like those Punjab National Bank fraud happening, which are banking fraud, not necessarily cybersecurity-related ones, but a bunch of people have got together and they are approving each other's things, including the manager, and that's how they swindled the bank of millions of dollars or hundreds of crores. And thereafter it was caught. So can a technical solution be applied? Possibly it's like the blockchain thing or something where that can be caught and prevented in time. The second thing goes deep down into the technical part in which you have SBOMs, so that you have the pedigree and provenance of software products which you are deploying, so that at every given point in time, you're very sure of what is it that you are doing. Take any of the systems that we have, for example, Microsoft Windows 11. Since the time it was released, a minimum of 2.5 GB worth of patches have been released for it. It does contain many of the security patches as well. So it goes to show that many of the systems that we hold, be it a mobile phone or a tablet or a laptop or servers or anything, there are security holes there. That means it's not perfect. So despite this, how do we prevent? So we have to adopt more rigorous standards and frameworks, as you mentioned, at every level, adopt a zero trust architecture and share information with each other on what are the best practices. That's what this best practices meet is all about. And I would like to turn to Anup.
From government point of view, I would say the ongoing process is creating awareness and capacity building, which is a continuous process. But more than that, major issue for a fraud investigation related matter is to get enhanced cooperation from the intermediaries. And that is a point I want to impress upon, because on an average, first we talk about delay for us, but when we ask for some information, we get a time slot of 10 to 15 days to get a reply. Now, for a investigator, after registering FIR, he has to wait for 10 to 15 days for his first step. Now, the moment somebody files a complaint, next day he starts coming to police station asking for the progress. Now, without first step, when a simple UPI fraud or a online transaction, the basic information we need from intermediary, and if without that we cannot proceed further. So that timeline that we have to reduce, otherwise it will be very difficult. For a IO, he has to file final report before the court within 60 days. Now, if I ask for one information from one intermediary and he takes 10 to 15 days, and then follow-up information is required from some other person, and almost 40, 50 days are gone in just getting the information. And when are you going to do the field work? When are you going to arrest the accused? And that is not happening. Very simple, anecdote. We used to get CCTV footages from ATMs. So earlier days, it was in the bank, and just go to the manager, and the manager, he'll give it in 5 minutes. Now it is centralized, now it is outsourced, different agencies managing. Now they say you mail it, and it goes to Bombay or Delhi somewhere. Takes long, 10, 15 days after, so many follow-ups and calls, we get the footage. That is for a simple ATM fraud. Now we are not talking about other aspects. Now, this is a major issue. I think that need to be addressed, and I have very strong criticism about the intermediaries abroad. So, no, not you. So, the server thing is actually creating a lot of pain for law enforcement. And your server is in Finland, my server is in US, my server is in XYZ place, and we cannot give. And that process of getting information through MLAT takes forever. And that, case, it ends there. That is one part. Second is, there are a couple of issues relating to reporting of crime, where we see a lot of incidents. They are not reported. And I'm not saying we are perfect, we are cracking every case, and we are arresting every criminal. Not that, but reporting is the first step, and that is lacking in some of the organizations we see. And we arrest the accused, 2 years, 3 years down the line, and he says, yes, I have done this and I have done that. And next step is, when he asks the organization, they completely deny. There was no breach. And one step further, some have paid ransom. And I have a case where people have paid ransom physically. The accused, you have met him, you have negotiated and paid. And that is like extreme case. So I personally feel reporting a crime is one thing that has to be done constantly. And second is preservation of evidence. Again, you have an incident, and you do all kinds of forensic analysis, and you have a report, you have everything. You don't preserve the evidence. And when we get to know, we ask for details or the logs or other evidence, that will not be available. That is a major concern. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, very good insights from the law enforcement point of view. I'm really looking forward to improvements in the process and the new law as well. I think everything has a bearing on each other. For example, the new privacy laws or the new cyber reference framework that is going to come out, which is going to be immensely helpful. So I'd like to ask Hilal.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Anup, thank you for that. This is a very well obvious suggestion. So, and Vishal, I think you eloquently actually summarized like what needs to be done to prevent frauds, right? And I totally agree with you, like on the aspect of basically stronger collaboration between the cyber teams and the financial risk teams or the risk teams themselves, right? So it makes a lot of sense, right? Otherwise, like if they work in silos, it makes obviously like it's a chaotic thing. People are not able to basically like connect the dots, and information gets lost, and everybody's trying to do the best thing, but they're not able to do so. Similarly, for basically what Anup was mentioning earlier, that sometimes they don't get the audit trails, they don't get the logs, they don't get the information that's necessary for them to basically do a full-scale investigation. So I think what Vishal earlier said was about basically common minimum framework. I think that makes a lot of sense, right? So if we have that framework in place, what happens that we will not have any ambiguity in terms of the requirements of basically solving cases. We will not have challenges in obtaining the evidence that's necessary. We will obviously all be on the same page. Right? There will be occasions, and we have to basically understand that as well. There will be technical challenges. There will be some business challenges that may not actually allow us to have that common minimum framework that will include everything. But even if we do actually solve this to 80% or 90%, that's actually good enough. So apart from that, I think from the business perspective, I think strong regulatory and legislative support is very important. If the privacy basically bill had not passed, we would still not be actually taking care of the data protection that's actually necessary to be done. So the governance and the compliance actually becomes like a lot more important. Apart from that, I think the most important tool in the arsenal for somebody to combat fraud is basically their strong policies. They need to actually have strong policies which are sort of like have interlinked policies that make sure that even if there is an unintentional way of basically somebody committing a fraud, that does not happen. So you need to have those checks and balances in place to make sure that when you actually build a system that's basically designed in a way to be basically sort of like resistant or basically immune to the fraud. How do we actually achieve that is through basically like what tools you were really talking about was basically the privacy by design, security by design, and of course like incident response by design or automated incident response that would allow us to collect all the artifacts that are necessary for us to basically support a case or support an investigation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So shortage of time now. I think we'll just do a rapid fire round on what are the top 3 future trends that people need to watch out for.
So I think if I say AI and ML, it will be a cliche, right? So, but I think, one thing which is definitely is happening and will continue to happen is that we will have more and more high tech being thrown at fraud management software. And I think we already have a significant amount of that already happening. And I talked about that in a bit. So that I think is definitely one trend. The second trend I think is very important. And I hope the industry responds for that because I think the regulations and regulators have ensured that they're making the ISPs and the corporations accountable for building controls. What I think we need to do more is how do we now also take steps as an industry to protect the end user? Because the end user PC and protection and what the end user finally does is not, there is no governance around that, right? And I think that's the fundamental root cause, right? So we haven't yet built systems which can be error-proof. We have left a lot to the user, and so therefore there is a need to protect it. I mean, as Securite, we do our bit to make sure that the endpoint is protected from anti-phishing and all those things. But I think people need to build more robust solutions by which we can enforce a common, consistent experience of security for the end user, right? So that's the second part. And the third part, I think, as a trend which will happen more and more, and I don't think it will stop, is that regulators will make the various service providers, various organizations more accountable for managing the fraud. Because most of the regulators, and I know, for example, RBI, looks at cybersecurity as a systemic risk to the ecosystem, right? And although we know for sure that as a country we have done significantly well in terms of managing and keeping the frauds under control, but it's still a zero tolerant kind of point for our RBI and regulators, and they don't want it to go out of control. And so you can expect a trend where there will be more intrusive supervision and more accountability entrusted on organization to manage fraud, as we are now talking about privacy, as we are talking about cybersecurity. I think ownership of fraud management and how to control that will also be more and more going forward.
Sure, thank you. We're out of time, but we'll stretch for a few more minutes with your permission. And just top 3 trends.
One scale of the crime, the scale of cyber crime is going to increase. I'll just give one quick example. Last year there was a case in Gujarat, Mehsana district, where the IPL was recreated. You must have heard it. The entire IPL was recreated with stadium, fake players and everything. It was broadcasted live on YouTube, and betting were taken from Russians. That is the scale we are talking about. Okay. That is a main concern. Second is crypto-related frauds, both investment-related and fake crypto offers, and these are going to increase. Is already on the rise, and there is a difficulty from law enforcement point of view to investigate those cases, and that is a challenge, and that is going to increase in the coming days.
I'll try to do this one sentence. I think it's going to be identity fraud. Then I think data security and data privacy fraud is going to be massive. And transnational fraud, and which includes the new age technology fraud. I think those are going to be major areas of concern going forward.
Thank you very much for your attention. We'll just take maybe a question or two. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you can ask.
So, sir, you told about rising technologies that is supporting the fraudsters. So I just want to quote one new trend that is going on. I don't know how many of you heard about IPFS. It's a interplanetary file system. So Anup sir has told that it's hard for the LEAs to track cross-country servers and issues. So this IPFS, what it does is that it has peer-to-peer nodes where we can actually upload a file. That file will be replicated in each and every nodes. So the LEAs, when they try to shut down one node, the others will be there. And the same thing is continuing. And this is used for phishing activities these days. So my question is that, sir, when you are upskilling, would an R&D based upskilling of the professionals needed? What is your take on that? From the traditional point of investigative techniques, or why can't we have a integrated R&D integrated upskilling technique for law enforcement, where they can actually tackle these type of rising technologies of the fraudsters?
Yeah, I think there are two elements to this. Okay, one is in terms of protection, and other is in terms of detection and response, right? I think when it comes to law enforcement, it's the latter, the detection and response, where we need to look at how do we empower them with the necessary training to deal with such frauds. But also more importantly, if we are seeing a trend or a pattern of a new vector or a new technique, then how quickly malware lab. And this is exactly what the threat researchers do day in, day out, right? So a particular researcher a day in a life of a researcher, they will work on 5 techniques in a day, right? And so I know you know what I'm talking about,
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
So they would look at this and immediately create a signature or a pattern and then distribute it. So I think both the things have to happen. And as you all know, it's a cat and mouse game, right? So you are always in a catch-up mode. You just gave one example of that, but there are millions of these happening on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead. Vineet. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask that what Anup said, the problem of LEAs not getting adequate support from the intermediaries. Do you think that every organization who's allowed to do business when it comes to online transaction already, in case they don't have an LEA cell, or if the LEA cells are there, do the LEA cells are required to be empowered to support the LEAs when the information is asking? So it's something like a customer care facing cell with respect to LEAs. So do you think that from the both the security companies and from the Anoop's, the LEA's perspective, how is it being handled?
So to answer basically, so what I've been doing is that like in any of these incidents that happened, let's take the popular examples of the Chinese app, right? So it actually was basically like detected quite late, very late actually. And the reason for it was basically the people did not realize that it was basically a fraudulent thing because the checks that they had in place, for example, the biannual KYC that they had to do, they did not do that, right? So in turn, what happened was that it got sort of like delayed in terms of capturing that evidence and all that. So when it comes to basically the cooperation between LE and the law enforcement agencies and the security whatever, the intermediaries, what happens is that like, it's usually like the ambiguity in the requirements, honestly. Like, so for example, like when we file the FIR and after the FIR, we had to wait for like a couple of days to understand what we need to provide. Right? I don't mean it to in a very divergent way. It's more like basically like even they're also trying to figure out because the nature of fraud is like this. They have to also sort of like triage and understand what are the different vectors or what are the different methods and sort of like mechanisms used to commit the fraud. And then they can ask us, okay, what are the things that you need from us? And that takes time, right? That takes time. It is frustrating for both the LE and us also, right? So it's usually like we try to basically do the best we can, and sometimes we fall short, right? So sometimes the LEA that try to do their best, they're always doing their best. Don't arrest me for that. Yeah. So they try to do their best, and it's always basically a collaborative effort, right? So that's when these cases get actually solved.
Yeah.
I mean, his question was more on the having exclusive cell in every company. I guess so. So that I completely agree.
Yes,
But I
yes.
don't agree they should not be allowed to do business. But I personally feel that every organization should have a legal cell or exclusive cell to support law enforcement, and a lot of especially small and intermediate companies, they lack that facility, and we have to search for all types of mail IDs, and then we list them, and then we send to all mail IDs of the company, and then if we are lucky, we get reply from some of
Yeah.
them.
So,
Thank you.
that begs the question, really very quick one for Vishal, that these software products that we are developing, which are in the nature of security and all that, how much do they enable forensics to happen? Because the more you enable it, their job becomes very easy, more easy, and it becomes easy for the organizations also. Let's say some healthcare organization has deployed your product and it is enabled beautifully with forensics, so that would help them, all the parties.
So the interesting part of all the breaches and all the frauds that have happened in the history of cybersecurity is that we have been able to identify the root cause and decipher them post the event. Okay? Sometimes it has taken us 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, but not a single fraud or a breach have not been investigated. So which means that we have all the necessary data in the telemetry, in all the technology solutions that we have, not just cybersecurity solutions, but any solution. The challenge for us as an industry is that we are able to do post facto. How do we turn the table and create solutions which are able to look at the same telemetry before the event happens and stop, right? And that's the problem statement, right? So that's how I'll respond. But I want to just maybe add to the point that we were discussing earlier. What do we need to do? I think two things. One is, see, expecting law and enforcement to get completely abreast with the latest tools and technologies in and understanding that and managing that is expecting too many things, right? Because there will always be a huge lag between how the fraudsters are changing their technique. So I think there is a need for a better collaboration between law and enforcement and the industry, where the industry becomes a backbone or the technical infrastructure to manage that for law and enforcement. We are already seeing that trend. I hope that trend will continue so that we are able to bridge that gap. I think that's number one. The second thing is more sort of confidence building, trust building measure, where I think we need to create a circle of trust between the industry and the law and enforcement, where we work as collaborators, because really the threat guy is somewhere else. The attacker is somewhere else, invisible. So unless we build a circle of trust where I know I can share my data with confidence, and at the same time law and enforcement also is able to sort of get whatever they expect from the service providers and from the companies, I think we still need a lot of work to be done to build that confidence building measures so that we work together as one entity to fight against that. So if we do both these things, I think we would be in a better position to manage and control the frauds in the future.
Sure. Thank you very much, the panelists. We are really out of time now. And thanks to the audience. I hope you could get some wonderful takeaways from this panel discussion. Thank you, everyone.